Welcome to Have a Life Teaching, the podcast designed for educators who are dedicated to enhancing their teaching practice and creating a positive impact on their students' lives. In each episode, we'll dive deep into the world of education, exploring a wide range of topics related to curriculum, instruction, and assessment in K-12 schools. Together, we'll learn from the brightest minds in the education field. So if you're a passionate educator who's ready to take your teaching practice to the next level, join us as we explore the exciting world of education. My name is John Shimbari, signing in and saying, let's have a life teaching. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Have a Life Teaching podcast. As many of you know, lots of teachers, at least in the States, are leaving the field of education. And so obviously we want to figure out ways to stem that mass exodus. So I'm really excited. As those of you know who listen, we've had multiple, like I said, guests like Sybil Hall talking about individual well-being. But tonight to have Aimee Parkinson, the CEO and founder of Wellness, joining us, who really is going to be talking about the difference between well-being and wellness and how the two concepts are actually interrelated. But before we get into all that, I'd love to welcome Aimee to our show. Aimee, thank you for being here.
Oh, John, what a lovely intro. Thank you so much for having me on. And I love to hear that you've had other guests on talking about the same thing because it's extremely important. So how exciting.
Yeah, and no matter how many people we have on, everyone brings a different spin on it and adds to the conversation that we've had, which I think just makes us all smarter in the process. I'm glad to have you on as well, because I don't think I've had many guests talking about how different concepts around well-being and wellness relate and how they differentiate from one another. So again, I think you're going to really add to our collective knowledge around this. So again, Aimee, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
Now, Aimee, I like to ask all my guests as I start our chat, what got you involved in education and how did wellness become your thing within education?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking. So I've been a teacher and school leader for over 12 years and I guess like many people sort of ended up there, but obviously have a bit of a backstory. I actually left high school and the career advisor at the time suggested that I would be a good event manager. So I actually went to university and studied event management and got kind of 2 or 3 years into that and just thought, oh, this is just not giving me meaning and purpose. Like, I don't think this is why I'm here. And I don't think that this is the passion and drive that I've got is to put on big corporate events for people. So I actually went back to university and studied teaching and did a double degree. And I happened to land a full-time job in my first year out. I became a school leader in my second year out. Wow. And then in my third year out, I started my Master's of Educational Leadership. And John, when I think back on that or say that out loud, I just sort of think, what was I thinking? Where was my self-awareness? Like, what was I doing? Because gosh, I made mistakes. I didn't communicate effectively. I didn't make the best decisions. I was overwhelmed. I was exhausted. I was just all the things because I had just taken on so much so quickly. And yeah, when I look back on it, I just think, wow, no wonder times were tough. And I actually went on, when you asked me then what was sort of the catalyst for me getting involved in the wellness space, probably 2016 maybe. I went on a college retreat. We had a leadership retreat for all of the leaders that were in the college that I was working at the time. We jumped on a bus and went for a 2 or 3 day retreat up the coast into this beautiful nature, into this beautiful hotel. And we just had all of these sessions that were run by external providers. And the theme of the conference was vulnerability. And it was a really thought-provoking and personally powerful couple of days for me because I was able to see executive leaders in the school. I was in middle management at the time. Executive leaders within the school put their hand up and say that they were finding things difficult, that actually they weren't managing their workloads either. They were finding difficult conversations hard. They were feeling burnt out. They were feeling exhausted. They were feeling all the things. And for the first time in years, I actually felt like I wasn't alone, because I was always for too long too scared to put my hand up and say how much I was struggling, because I was at that time so driven to be a leader in a school. And so there was so many narratives and stories that I was telling myself. So to hear them say that at the conference was really, really powerful. And we got back on the bus to come back, and I thought, wow, things are going to change, because senior leaders in this school have addressed all of these things. They know that everyone's feeling the same way. So surely we're going to get back and things are going to change. And John, weeks and weeks went by and nothing changed. And that for me was a big, like, poignant moment where I realized two things. One, school leaders and schools don't know where to start. The demand is so high in education that they just don't know where to start when it comes to looking after their staff. And two, the individual responsibility we have for ourselves, that no one was going to tell me when to go to sleep, when to stop marking, when to rest on the weekends, when to get out and move and do some physical activity. Like, that all fell on me. And even though there was sort of blame, and there was this and that, and the system this and the school this, and all these reasons that I gave, actually it was my responsibility to look after myself. So that's where my passion for wellbeing started. And then ever since 2016, I've just upskilled myself whilst being a teacher and school leader in the field of wellbeing and wellness, and just slowly built credentials to then form Wellnest, well-nest. I was on a podcast last week and they said, Aimee, be careful when you say Wellnest, because it sounds like you're saying wellness when you're talking about your business. So I know it's a little bit confusing, but it is Wellnest. And that was really the catalyst. And I've just been working on it for a really long time.
So now, how did you come around to the name Wellnest for your company?
What a great question. So when I founded Wellness, I, not dissimilar to you, had started a podcast, The Wonders of Wellbeing, and I was talking to experts around the globe around the space of wellbeing in education. And I had no intention for that podcast other than to learn. And as I learned through that podcast and I started to upskill myself with different programs and courses, I decided that I wanted to create a brand that was going to support wellbeing in schools, but I had no idea what it was going to do or what it was going to be, but I just wanted to start it. So I knew that well was part of it, and the whole idea or the big picture for Wellnest is for it to be a hub of wellbeing education. So I thought nest was another word for hub, and ta-da, we've got Wellnest.
Exactly. And to your point that you said before, I think it's an important hub, because even in the States, we talk about wellness and well-being, but yet there really are few systems, at least here, that are actually doing the work around that. So when you were talking about nobody telling you when to eat or when to rest, I think something similar is happening here. We talk the talk, but what does it actually mean? And how are we supporting our teachers and our leaders to do these things? Because how can they give to students if they themselves are depleted?
Absolutely.
And I'm not surprised you were feeling depleted, because it's also amazing that you became a leader in 2 years in teaching. I am very impressed by that, by the way, Aimee. It took me a lot longer to make that jump, and I still felt in some ways like an imposter. And I also actually did a show on imposter syndrome that's coming out. So there's a tie into, I think, that as well. So to your point about nobody telling you how to maintain yourself, and to my comment about we talk about wellness and well-being, but we're really on a systemic level aren't real. We don't really have a playbook for it, so to speak, right? Like, so to that end, what would you say should be the playbook, or should it be the playbook? Why should systems care about this? Maybe systems shouldn't care about this, but I think they do. But why do you think that systems should care about wellness and well-being?
I think you hit the nail on the head earlier, John, when you said that, I mean, if teachers and school leaders aren't well, then, and they're depleted, then how can they teach and lead well? Like, at the end of the day, in the most basic terms, the heart of schools, of course, is students and has been for a very long time. but that's not going to exist without the adults. And student wellbeing is incredibly important, equally as important, and has had a lot of work for a long time. And a lot of statistics would show us that mental health in students is worse than it's ever been. So there's something even in that we're getting a bit mixed up and we're getting a little bit wrong. And I think a starting point to all of that is that the teachers aren't well themselves. So when you're trying to support whoever it is that you're trying to support as a person, whether you're in the workplace or in your personal life, if you're not well yourself, then how can you give? It's near impossible. And like at the core of wellbeing, John, and when we talk about Dr. Felicia Hubert, who did a lot of research about wellbeing, she talks about wellbeing being the definition that you're feeling good and functioning effectively. And some people, again, deem wellbeing and wellness as quite fluffy. Feeling good, functioning effectively, oh yeah. But actually, if I sat down with someone and actually unpacked feeling good for them and functioning effectively for them and asked lots of questions, I think they'd soon realize that they're either finding both hard to answer or actually that one of them may not be as good as they think it is once we actually start to unpack what that actually means for them and in their job and in their workplace and in their personal life. And it's so important for us to recognize that wellbeing ebbs and flows. It is so multidimensional and it is so incredibly important, but so complex. And that's why I think school leaders' heads are spinning and they don't know where to start, because it is multidimensional, it is complex, and it's equally important for us to have responsibility for ourselves as it is for us to have collective wellbeing as well. And we're talking about things like employee engagement. We're talking about productivity and performance. We're talking about attendance of staff, collaborating and teamwork, our creativity and our innovation, our attrition, but also our retention of staff, and positive school culture all feeds into how well our staff are. And I think there's a big misconception around what wellbeing actually is, and that there is a science to it, and that we're not just out there pulling things from thin air and just saying that this is how it should be, that actually there's a science to the way we as humans function. And wellbeing plays a huge part in that. And the more that we can educate people around that and them to understand what it actually means, to then be able to link it to their purpose and meaning, is so important.
What advice would you give for both the individual within a school system, say the teacher, to have agency in promoting their own well-being? And then what advice would you give for administrators out there who are trying to create school cultures that embrace well-being? So what are they doing in terms of promoting wellness, which hopefully will lead to the feelings of well-being that we want in schools?
Yeah, great question. And again, I could sit and talk to you about this for hours. So I've had to sort of think a little bit here about kind of the message that I'd like to share, and sort of three, not necessarily hacks that people are going to go, oh yeah, I can take that and do it, but maybe more thought-provoking things for people. Because again, it's not just about picking something up and doing it. It's got to have meaning and purpose to you. So Some of these hacks are a little bit deeper. But first, I just thought we could just discuss the difference between wellbeing and wellness.
Please.
Because there is a difference. And I think sometimes we're getting a little bit confused. So in its simplest form, wellbeing is the state of our mind. So our emotional, our physical, our psychological, our state of our mind is kind of that deep work that we have to do. So it's kind of unpacking, obviously, what it means to feel good and function effectively, but also reflect on how we are actually feeling, how we are functioning effectively, but then also what can we do to change that? What are the strengths and what's working well, and then what could be even better? Wellness is actually the state of us being, the actual doing part of what we do. So a lot of our personal responsibility falls on that wellness part, that action that we take to look after ourselves. And a lot of things that you mentioned that you've already had guest speakers on around nutrition, our physical health, our sleep, our hydration, our rest, all those things fall under wellness, which play a really important part. And then the well-being is that deeper work. It's that sense of meaning, that sense of purpose, that sense of fulfillment that allows us to be productive, that allows us to be resilient during hard times, allows us to have energy to actually function. When I say to teachers, what have you done before you get to work to set your day up for success? And they're like, oh, well, I didn't get to sleep till late because I was marking, and I had to get up early because I've got to do this before I get to work. And, and there's sort of like all these things. And I'm like, okay, well, hang on a minute. Let's just stop for 1 second. Why is it that the sleep is the part that's impacting you most? And then once they actually start to unpack what's happening in the night, they're realizing that either they're using time ineffectively, or actually it's the guilt that they have to not do things that's then impacting them most, rather than starting to set some boundaries. So there's some really, really deep work in our meaning and purpose and fulfillment in what we're doing in that well-being space of how we're feeling. But then in that wellness space, that action that we're doing each day to set ourselves up is so important. And it definitely ebbs and flows. I would never, ever, ever sit here and say that everyone should be feeling good and functioning effectively all day, every day, and then you've peaked at optimum well-being. Well-being you have to work at every day, all day. It's not something that just you then tick that box and you're feeling good and then it just stays that way. It is something that we work on forever. So if we can define it together, if we can understand it together, and then if we can then action and implement together, that to me is the most powerful way for us to combat wellbeing in education, rather than just focusing on individual or just collective. It's actually both. So when we're talking about
I'm sorry, go ahead. I apologize.
No, go for it. I'll just go into my hacks. That was just my ramble on definitions there.
Well, I love that you're going to go into your hacks, because I was going to ask you, what do you do in your business to help schools do the doing individually and collectively?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first hack is, to me, is accepting and recognizing our own responsibility of well-being, and then the collective responsibility. And so I think, as we said earlier, there's just so much misunderstanding about what it means. And I think people just don't understand their own responsibility and then the collective responsibility. So I think that accepting and recognizing that actually I, as an educator, am responsible for my own well-being and wellness to some extent. Yes, also my workplace is responsible for some of the well-being as well. So I think that recognition, I think COVID, post-pandemic, there's a lot of tension, negative tension in the education space that was already there, no doubt. But I'm just finding that the media is just filled with a lot of negativity at the moment. And that's then just fueling negative language being used in the education space, rather than a little bit of acceptance and recognition around, okay, let's press a little bit of a reset button here. What is my responsibility, and then what is the collective responsibility? So when we're talking about wellness of ourselves, as we've said, our sleep, our nutrition, our physical activity, our hydration, our rest, our stress toolbox, they're all things that we can be doing to look after ourselves. And at Wellness, we run a lot of workshop facilitation where we go in and run sessions across various topics. Again, wellbeing can be quite broad. We've got a bunch of workshops that we run in and do actionable things for schools based on their context. But we also do a lot of consulting work. So we actually go in and work with school leaders strategically. And at Wellness, we're big believers that we can't just go in with a teacher wellbeing sign, advocating for teacher wellbeing, and forget that actually it is part of a system and it is part of a big community, and we actually need to see it through that lens. So we work really closely with school leaders to align their strategic vision with whatever it is that they want to work on with their staff wellbeing. And that all comes from data. We're not making any of it up. School leaders that we work with are not saying, I think we need to work on this, this, and this. It's actually everyone's voice through a big phase of assessment that sort of comes from. So the workshop facilitation is a bit of that action doing, but we also do a lot of consulting work strategically with schools to help with that acceptance and recognition and that understanding of what it means. When we're talking about well-being, when it comes to recognition and acceptance, we're talking about meaning and purpose. We're talking about reconnecting with the vocation of education. I think the pandemic sort of flipped that for a lot of teachers, and I think they've kind of lost a little bit of their passion and their drive for what they actually get up every day to do. Their resilience toolbox, their self-awareness, the compassion that they've got for themselves. And then when we're talking about collectively, we're talking about teamwork. We're talking about relying on people's strengths. We're talking about setting boundaries, building resilience, the conversations and communication that we're having with each other, the psychological safety of the environment. Like, there's some really big words that have just been floated there that, we could have a whole podcast on to unpack. But that's that collective part that just plays such a really big part. But if I'm expected to come in and work cohesively and collaboratively and with teamwork in my team at school, if I'm coming in with a negative mindset and I haven't had enough sleep and I haven't really been hydrated and I haven't slept well and I haven't been able to move and exercise because I've been doing all these things, I'm not coming into that the best version of myself that I could be that day. My own responsibility plays a huge part in that collective. And that's why I like to discuss both, because I'm so passionate about both of them playing such a big part.
Yeah, and it's important too, because administrators could put professional learning community time within a schedule.
Mm-hmm.
They could make the time available to teachers to work together, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
teachers can't necessarily do that. Admin has to put that in the schedule. But you're bringing up a very good point. If I don't feel safe in sharing how I truly feel about things, or if those PLC times do not allow multiple voices to be speaking, only having the time and saying, yeah, we have a PLC, that's important, but that's only step one. You have to have a team that teams together, that works together. When you talk about feeling safe, but also too, to your point, it's not just about the feelings, but what am I doing when I come to that space to ensure that I am my best version of myself, which means, have I rested? Have I exercised? Am I coming fully charged as well?
Yeah,
So
definitely.
when you go into a school, what is a typical engagement like? Or if you want to answer this version of the question, what has been your most successful engagement and why?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, look, John, I think in education, there's a lot of tick box that's been happening for a long time, where they're just sort of doing things to tick a box. And even where you just said there, you can have a PLC and you can create an environment within that PLC, yes, but even before you've got a PLC, there's so much work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And schools are sort of like, oh, we've got this and we've created this space and this group's going to do this. But there's so much more to do before that coming into a school and assessing what it is that their vision is, like why they've actually got you in. Like, one of my first questions I ask is, why have you got me in today? And it's fascinating to hear why they've got you in. And I think sometimes they don't really know why. They know that something needs to change. They don't really know what the next step is. They've had teachers complain that they need to do something. Sometimes it has come from them that they want to take a direction strategically over the next 5 years to create a space of wellbeing for staff. But the best scenario is walking in and actually having meaning and purpose to the leaders of the school, that they genuinely put their hand up and say, hey, I don't know what to do. We are lost. We think we do this, this, and this well, but we need help with this. We need support. We're not experts in this area, but we know it's important and we want it to work strategically for our school, rather than just coming in with a strategic plan that's already been written that just says a staff wellbeing action plan on it, that's actually already written on the strategic plan, but they have no idea what that plan looks like. And actually, before you even have that plan, there's things that you need to do. So our very first kind of phase is understanding what their vision and mission is in why they've got us in, but also starting to unpack what they want it to look like, what they foresee things to be over the next 5 years. And then we have to assess what the current environment is. And that's both qualitative and quantitative data. It's numbers and it's anonymous. And then there's, one-on-one qualitative interviews where we sort of unpack it. And look, it's quite a long process. People can jump on my website to have a look, because again, this could be its own podcast in itself,
Sure.
sort of the process that we go through. But that first phase is really understanding, where are things at now? What's working really well? Where are our strengths? And actually, what could be even better? Not focusing on what's bad or what's not working, but actually everything that we do, we can tweak and work with. And I think, John, a lot of school leaders get worried and they get overwhelmed by the idea that if they get someone in to help them, that things are going to just flip and change and everything's just and it's just going to add more work for them. And then there's all these panics. And it's what we love about Wellness and the work that we're doing is we're trying to be resourceful with the resources that the schools already have. So whatever your means of communication is, like a lot of schools that I work with, communication ends up being a stressor for staff. The way that they're communicating, how often they're communicating, all these kinds of things around communication that's causing staff to not function effectively for various reasons. And sometimes you can sort of see school leaders sort of just think, oh my, like we've got this system now, and we've paid for this system for the next 5 years, and that's okay. Let's actually just look at, if you send out like a daily email or a daily bulletin that's got a whole bunch of updates on it, things for teachers to do, reminders for them, surveys that they've got to answer, notices for kids that they've got to share, whatever it is that's in that kind of daily communication, if that's overwhelming staff, because they're expected to read it before they start work, but they're also expected to prep for the day, so that's overwhelming as soon as they walk in, how could you categorize and plan out that email to make it easy for staff? So if you're in elementary, here this section is for you. And if you're in the upper years, this is for you. And this part's for all staff, or this part's for admin. And there'd be like subheadings so that if I'm a grade 2 teacher, I know which part of that email I need to go to check. And then, yes, that's then on my productivity. And again, this is where the individual planning and executive functioning comes in, about how I then action, whatever it is that I've been asked to do on that email. But instead of just flipping it and trying to come up with a really basic way to communicate, no, communication is really important in a school. And often that daily email is the way to get to everybody. And it is the teacher's responsibility, the individual teacher's responsibility to check that and to action it. But how can we help them in the mornings make that a little bit more efficient and reduce the stress and overwhelm of an email at 7:45 a.m. when I know students are coming in at 8 a.m. How can we make that a little bit? So that's kind of like that action part, John, around, and something that we say over and over again at Wellness is that good old James Clear Atomic Habits, 1% better every day. We're not trying to come in to flip everything and expect that within the next semester, everything's going to be fixed. That's one thing we have to accept with wellbeing. It is long-term work. And if we can do 1% better each day, that's better than none. And over time, that accumulates. And so I think there's a little bit of a perception around, we come in and then we just flip everything and then we click our fingers and it's all fixed. No, there's a lot of upskilling. There's a lot of unpacking. There's a lot of process work that goes into it. And at Wellness, we create a staff wellbeing growth plan that's really detailed, that does a lot of the analysis work, a lot of voice from everybody, and then strategic vision, and sort of aligns all that for like those small steps that we can then start to implement change. Whose responsibility is it? What tasks do they need to do by when? And just slowly have increments of things that schools can do to increase it. Because it's not just chocolates on a Friday. It's not just meeting-free weeks. It's not just yoga. It's so much more than that. And those things aren't bad. I'm not at all saying that part of our well-being is something that we need to get rid of, because people enjoy that. It's a way to connect people together, but that's not the answer. That's not well-being for staff.
It's funny, I was sitting here chuckling a little bit because I can't tell you how many client engagements I have done where communication has been an issue. And we've had conversations about the daily newsletter as well, the emailed newsletter, and how it's overwhelming certain staffs. Is there anything, though, that you really feel we haven't covered that you really want listeners to know about wellness and well-being?
Yeah, there is. There's just one more thing I just thought in the hack part is around relational support. That plays a really big part in our well-being, is who we're communicating with, leaning on, putting our hand up to say, hey, I need a bit of help. And that help and support and opinions that we get from people by putting our hands up. And I think it's really important that for educators, we do create spaces for them to reflect, that we create spaces for them to unpack the complexities of the demands of the education world, and for them to have that emotional support. And I think sometimes when we do that, I heard this amazing analogy. I, like you, John, taught in Japan for 2 years, and I actually flew back to present a keynote at a conference a couple of months ago.
Nice.
And we were talking about a sticky note analogy. about support and relational support that we have. So if you have something that you need some support on emotionally, and you've got a little post-it note and you stick it onto that first person, and it's super sticky. So it really sticks to that person, whatever it is. And you might feel better because you've then offloaded it and shared it, but they're kind of carrying that sticky note. And then as that sticky note gets put on other people, the stickiness gets less and less. And I think my message here is that we just need to be mindful of who we're always going to first for that relational support, especially in the education setting, because if that sticky note is going on that same person every time, the first time, and that stickiness is constantly on them, then how is that impacting them? And I think that relational support, we just have to be really mindful of that in education, because we feed off each other's emotions and feelings, and it plays a really big part in how it impacts others and our team. So, if we're bringing things to our team meetings and things that are really sticky, that it's the first time we've kind of mentioned it out loud, and that sticky note is going into our team for the first time, every time, they're carrying that always.
Right.
So just being mindful of who we're relying on where. And that's why at Wellness, a big part of what we do is coaching staff and teachers to create a space for them to reflect and to unpack and to set goals and to really understand themselves personally and professionally, so that sticky note isn't going on people within their own environment, that actually it's going on to someone else who's got the capacity to hold that space for them. I think as I've reflected this year on Wellness and the successes and the challenges, is probably feel like damage is probably a big word, but the impact that it can have on staff when schools start the process of looking after their staff wellbeing and then they stop. And I think there is often really good intentions in school leaders to start this process. And as you and I both know, having been in education for a long time, other things come up. I totally understand that. And sometimes that means that we need to navigate and move around the original plan timeline that we had. But to just stop is probably the most detrimental thing that we can do, because we're losing trust, we're losing motivation, we're losing inspiration, we're losing meaning by standing up in front of your staff and saying, we are going to prioritize you. We want you to be well in the space. We want to unpack what we're doing well and what could be even better, to assess it, to get this plan going, to start it, and then just to stop can be so detrimental. So that really important part of communicating always, even if it has to stop for a little bit, and that whole 1% better each day as like the biggest takeaway when we're talking about trying to implement change. And even towards the back end of this year, I've started to receive quite a few inquiries around me helping them chair some of their meetings when it comes to wellbeing, because an external provider can come in with a little bit more accountability drive than just relying on teachers to give up their free time to come in to talk about wellbeing, for that then nothing to be actioned. And I think that there's some amazing wellbeing committees that are out there, a bit like PLCs, a bit like what you've just shared, but they're kind of going around and around in circles because no one in that PLC knows what to do. They also don't have the authority to make decisions anyway. It's constantly got to go back up to senior lead, and then it's just getting lost. So there's actually been a little bit of outreach recently to support the PLC groups in driving that change as well, if they're the ones that are responsible, even if that be that we haven't done consulting work with the school, but we're actually just coming in to help strategically with that group, is really interesting that they're noticing that internal work is often more powerful, especially when we're talking about wellbeing, to be from an external provider that understands how that change can work.
So Aimee, where can people find out more about you and Wellness and your work in general?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm definitely most active on LinkedIn. So Aimee Parkinson on LinkedIn, please jump on and follow or reach out and send me a message. I'd love to hear from you. We've got a website, www.well-nest.com.au. And of course, anyone can email me, amy@wellnest.com.au, but I can share these links with you, John, and maybe we can just put them in the show notes.
We will indeed. So Aimee, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And John, to any educators who are listening, thank you so much to everything that you're doing, for everything that you're doing. And gosh, you're making a difference every day, and you're being heard, and you're seen, and we're here for you. So feel free to reach out.
Great. Thanks again, Aimee.
Cheers. Thanks, John.
Thank you for listening today. I hope you got some great tips that you can bring back into your teaching. Remember, have a life teaching without sacrificing your own. Also, don't forget to subscribe and be well.